Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Sarah Brown.
I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Westvick.
Each episode we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, so we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/TolkienExperience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. So today I have with me a guest that barely needs any introduction, but yet I'm going to give you some introduction. So I have with me today Brian Sibley, and he's an honorary member of the Tolkien Society and a recipient of the Society's Outstanding Contribution Award 2022. And as I'm sure we're all aware, has had a long media association with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Now, back in 1981, Brian prepared The Lord of the Rings for the BBC's celebrated radio dramatisation, and he co-wrote the series' 26 weekly episodes starring Ian Hull, Michael Hordern and Robert Stephens. He also abridged The Hobbit for a radio reading by Michael Hordern and dramatised 4 of Tolkien's shorter works under the title Tales from the Perilous Realm, again featuring Michael Hordern, with a cast including Brian Blessed, Nigel Planer and Alfred Molyneux. And he's a multi-award-winning dramatist. His serializations also include The Chronicles of Narnia, The History of Titus Groan, The Once and Future King, The Pilgrim's Progress, Watership Down, and books by Ray Bradbury, Roald Dahl, and many others. So Brian has written and presented a number of radio features about Tolkien and his books, as well as compiling J.R.R. Tolkien and Audio Portrait, the audio celebration Microphones in Middle-earth. Brian's books include The Maps of Tolkien's Middle-earth with artist and illustrator John Howe, and 2 series of publications that chronicle the making of Peter Jackson's film trilogies based on The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, along with the biography Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey. Other books include The Land of Narnia, Shadowlands, The True Story of C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman, and The Wisdom of C.S. Lewis, as well as books on children's literature, fantasy cinema, and animation. That is quite the CV, but I want to say thank you once again, Brian, for joining us today. It's really great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sarah. Did I really do all that? Oh, I must have done, I suppose.
Yeah, according to that list, you really did.
Well, I'm quite old now, so there's a good reason.
Well, the glory is that you've contributed to our world of Tolkien in a way that's very different to the scholarship that is available. You've actually brought Tolkien's work to life for us in many ways, but in a different way to the Jackson films that we've had. So, the radio dramatizations were my first experience of Tolkien that wasn't on paper.
I think a lot of people encountered the books via the radio station series. Indeed, I know that the Tolkien Society at the time, 1981, when it came out, were deluged with people wanting to join the society as a result of it, which was great. But yes, you're correct, Sarah. I'm a writer, storyteller, I think, is probably the best way I describe myself. I once went for a job with a film producer of a very well-known film franchise. I got the job in the end, but to write some tie-in books. It wasn't Peter Jackson. And he said to me, I see on your CV you describe yourself as a writer. And I said, yes. And he said, well, actually, I was looking for an author. I did. Yes, I said no too, and but I did do the books in the end. But the interesting thing for me is that is how I see myself, as somebody who tells stories. I'm not an academic. I've never been an academic. I never went to university. I have no degree. And Sarah, when I sit alongside you or some of your contemporaries, our contemporaries, I find myself really anxious because I know that I'm sitting there with people who have a completely different understanding of these books to me. Not a different understanding, actually, but a different depth of appreciation or knowledge to me. So I'm always hesitant about my own CV in that sense. But what I do love is stories I love 2 things. First of all, stories that move people and shape people, and stories that have moved and shaped me as a person. And the list you read out of books from The Pilgrim's Progress, which I read when I was a very young kid, through to the works of Ray Bradbury, which I discovered in my teens and just fell in love with and began a 30-year correspondence relationship with Ray. All those books are books that have been integral to my life. I adapted one book for radio, which was a book by Jeffrey Archer, which had just been published. Well, I wrote the dramatization before the publication, and it's the only book I've ever adapted where I haven't had some personal investment in it as somebody who's a recipient of stories. So that's my kind of background. Yes, but I'm always delighted to talk with people who know more about Tolkien than I do, which is a lot of people, because I learn from that process too. So
I don't know that we would say that people know more about Tolkien than you, because you've immersed yourself in Tolkien in a very particular and very creative way. And so your understanding of Tolkien, it may be different to an academic understanding, but it's just as in-depth.
Yes, I guess so. I mean, one of the things that I think shaped the 1981 broadcast, and I was quite a young guy at the time and really very inexperienced. I was very lucky to grab the job or be offered the job, actually, is that I approached that job as how do we tell this book, which is a book I love and revere, but how do we tell it, in this case, under the rather intense strictures of 30-minute episodes, 26 weeks. Everyone's got to end with some kind of a cliffhanger, and everyone has got to be able to tell all the threads of the story that are going on. And, of course, my decision was obvious. I just went to the appendix to The Lord of the Rings, and I followed the chronology of The Tale of Years. And but that I know, because I'd read Tolkien's letters and Humphrey Carpenter's biography, I knew that Tolkien would have loathed that, because for him, the way he told the story, following one group of people and then going to the, say, Sam and Frodo and Gollum, and then going to Aragorn, Gimli and Legolas and so on, that was how he wanted the story told. But I also knew that was not going to work in that particular format. So I had to approach the books, as it were, from the inside out, I guess. And all the time I was doing it, I was thinking, oh, what would the professor think? Oh, he would be so unhappy. But the nicest thing happened the other week, which is that my editor at HarperCollins, who was going through some material relating to Tolkien's letters, came across a letter not from the professor, but from Christopher, saying to someone that he had just read the first few episodes of the 1981 Lord of the Rings BBC production, and the scripts are really rather good. And really rather good were 3 words that I thought, well, I'm really glad to know that, actually.
Gonna take that.
Exactly.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, adaptation, of course, has been at the forefront of people's minds about Tolkien recently, and how adaptation actually can change the way in which the text is brought forward. But perhaps we can come to some of your thoughts on adaptation anyway, because obviously that's been such an integral part of your connection with Tolkien. But I want to ask you first, how were you first introduced to Tolkien?
The Hobbit. Like so many people, I read The Hobbit in the school library. I didn't have a copy of it at the time, but I read it. I became chief librarian in terms of the kids, not the teachers. And I loved it because it was a great way of skiving out of things I didn't like doing, to go to the library rather than sport, which I hated. And I spent lunchtimes and sort of breaks in the library, and somebody mentioned it to me and said, "Have you read The Hobbit?" And I read that school library edition, which was a rather dull cover, but completely hooked on it. And so immediately, of course, I wanted to read more, because the way I react to books is, if I like something, I want to know more of what that author's done. So I got a copy of The Lord of the Rings. I bought the big fat paperback, the one where you wouldn't necessarily know because it's of my generation, but there was this single volume which had an illustration on the cover by Pauline Baynes, and it looked kind of fantastic because it was all red and yellow and bright. And
that was my dad's cover. That's what he had.
Yeah. And there was like interlocking trees, and between the trees you had this vista on the front of the Shire, and on the back of Minas Tirith and Mordor facing one another. And I started reading the prologue about hobbits, and I just couldn't get into it. I got really kind of stuck, and I stayed stuck. I didn't get to chapter 1 at all. Several times I tried to read the book, and in the meanwhile, I had come across the smaller works. In fact, some of them, as they were published, like not Farmer Giles had been published, but Smith of Wootton Major, for example, and Tom Bombadil. And so I was still sort of linking myself with Tolkien because I loved his storytelling, but just had this block about the Lord of the Rings. But then I was 21 years old and I developed a duodenal ulcer, a bit young for developing a duodenal ulcer, but I did. And in those days, this was kind of like Carry On Nurse era. So you went into hospital, had complete bed rest and ate slops. And there was a kind of Hattie Jakes matron who would come round and turn the lights out at night and tell you to go to sleep and so on. It was awful. I had a month of being... I took with me into hospital the big book, and I thought, this is it. This is the opportunity. I've got a complete bed rest. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything else. There weren't televisions and things like that in the ward at the time. I'm just going to read this book. And I skipped the prologue, I'm ashamed to say. I read it later. Started with chapter 1, and I guess by about page 70, 80 something, I was completely hooked. And I just lay there reading it and got my parents to bring a torch into me so I could read under the bedclothes at night, when the nurses weren't looking. I was in like a cubicle, so it's quite easy to do. And I just read the book in about a week and a bit. I loved it passionately and thought, why have I waited this long to read this story? So that was my introduction. Around that time, I wrote to Tolkien. I was so caught up with my admiration for him. And I decided I couldn't send the big paperback. It was going to be too heavy to send off into the post, and it would cost a lot, and I'd have to give the return postage, and I didn't know how I was going to do it and all that kind of thing. So I sent him my copy of Tom Bombadil, and he came back with a very nice letter from Joy Hill, who was his secretary at George Allen and Unwin, the then publishers. And he had inscribed it for me and had corrected one of the poems where there was a misprint in the poem, which it's just an addition in the margin, but he had bothered to go through and do that. So that's a very special book. And then years later, I managed to persuade Pauline Baines to also autograph it, sign it for me. It's flat side, as the auctioneer's parlance has it.
Oh, goodness.
So it's not inscribed to me. And Pauline said, I can't sign it. I can't sign it because it'll take the value down of the book. And I said, well, I don't think it will, Pauline, but it's not about the value of the book in monetary terms. It's about the value of the book to me. So she reluctantly signed it. So I have a double-signed copy, not a particularly important edition, not a first or anything like that, but it's special to me. So, there's been that, so really from The Hobbit onwards, but it's been in the early days on and off. But since, I've just, every now and again, every few years, something happens. And like the books with John, the map books with John Howe, which I love doing. I've done a couple of calendars, just introducing a couple of calendars for HarperCollins. I was able to write a long essay for somebody else who I corresponded with, which is Tove Jansson, whose illustrations for The Hobbit. So I wrote a kind of afterward for the Finnish edition of that. Can't be published over here because Christopher Tolkien had such hostility towards Tove Jansson's drawings that I don't know whether it will ever be published in this country, but maybe one day. So I've kept these things all along.
Wow. Well, I think Pauline was very wrong that signing your book would actually bring the value down. I think
she was extraordinarily modest about everything, Sarah. I mean, she really that was her manner all the time. Oh, my picture's not worth anything. I did a book with her called The Land of Narnia, which was about C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and the background to them, and there was a sort of section on each of them. It was a book for young children, really. And Pauline was asked to do some extra pictures for it, which she did. And the doorbell went one day, and I went down, and there was a big parcel. And when I opened it, it was all the artwork that she'd done, the new artwork she'd done for the book, with a note saying, I can't send this to the publisher because I'm not sure it's good enough. So will you have a look at it and tell me if you think it's all right? If there's anything I ought to change before sending it? Well, this is in the days before the internet and all the rest of it. So I looked through them all, thought, gosh, they're great. And I just repacked it up and, in fact, delivered it to the publisher that day. But that's symptomatic of how she was. She was extremely self-effacing and unsure about her work. And she took a couple of knockbacks, I guess. I mean, it's worth saying this because this all sounds very happy and jolly, our conversation. But I think it's worth noting that both Lewis and Tolkien slightly upset Pauline because Lewis had I think, surprising reaction to some of her drawings for the Narnian Chronicles, and wrote to Tolkien, I think, but to somebody anyway, and saying the trouble with Pauline is she can't draw a lion. And Tolkien was also recorded as having said, well, I don't think her dragons are quite right either. She took these really personally when she discovered them late in her career, and they distressed her quite a lot. Mm-hmm. But, they are now, of course, inextricably linked with the books that they appeared in. And, rather like you could, if you chose, criticize Ernest Shepard for something in his Winnie the Pooh books or John Tenniel for something in his Alice book illustrations, but the fact is they were the first person to do it, and in some sense their view of it, though it's been changed by lots of other people. I mean, so much fan art in Tolkien's and Lewis's case, but particularly Tolkien's case is out there, that you can see there are so many possible interpretations. So it is but just one, but it was the first, and first illustrators, for my mind, are always valuable because they're the first person to have interpreted it and worked with the author.
Mm-hmm. And therefore are not as influenced by other people's creative visions.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I find it very interesting, for example, I first came to Roald Dahl when his books were first published, and I've got both the first editions of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach, and of course they were illustrated by completely different people to the illustrations which now feature in the books, which are by Quentin Blake, a great artist, somebody I know and admire enormously. But, Quentin's interpretation is not the same as those in those first two editions. And I find it very intriguing to just look at those and sometimes wonder, obviously, in the case of Dahl, the publishers wanted a uniformity, which I understand. But there was something special about those early interpretations because they had something which was not dependent on Dahl's subsequent popularity or appreciation by anybody. They were just a reaction to the book, that the illustrator was tackling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you've told us how you came across The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, some of the Tales from the Perilous Realm. When did you first read The Silmarillion then? When it first came out?
Yes, I did. Yes, I mean, I now look back and think how amazing it was. I went to the launch of Humphrey Carpenter's biography. My copy is inscribed. We shared another passion, which was Lewis Carroll. And so my copy is inscribed by Humphrey to a fellow Carolian, which is interesting since we both ended up as fellow Tolkienians, if that's the correct term. And so I read that when it first came out. And of course, the Silmarillion came out a few months later. And I remember, all kinds of things. I remember critical reviews of it in papers. I remember Private Eye being particularly monstrous about it and saying it was something like notebooks from my father's wastepaper basket or something like that.
I've seen that.
And I found particularly the creation narrative was so powerful. And so a few years back now, I offered the BBC a way of trying to dramatize sections of the Silmarillion. I knew it couldn't be a serial, but I thought it could make a series of really dramatic pieces of radio, and the BBC weren't interested at all. But I was completely immersed in that early narrative. I think partly because I've been brought up in a very Christian atmosphere and a church attending, and I knew my Bible very well. And I think I kind of warmed to the high tone of Tolkien's writing, I would say, which you get glimpses of course, in The Lord of the Rings, when people talk in that high, slightly mannered, medieval kind of speak. But I loved the way it was written, and it reminded me of the Bible, it reminded me of Milton and Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained and Bunyan and all these other people who had influenced me quite early in life, and Shakespeare, of course, enormously. So I loved it. I loved it a lot. I found it distracting that, of course, there were bits and pieces in the way. It wasn't just like start at page 1 and go on to the end. That was a bit of a surprise. But I read it, as I did Unfinished Tales when that was published. So, I have, as I have, of course, the first editions I bought at the time, but it was a sense of beginning to discover about Tolkien. I think it's something I say in my introduction to The Fall of Númenor, actually, that we were given these insights. Of course, there are insights into Númenor and the Second Age in The Lord of the Rings, but they're kind of passing, and you don't have to worry about them or necessarily know anything in order to be able to just appreciate them. And the magic of Gil-galad was an elven king is a beautiful piece of poetry, whether you know who Gil-galad was or not. But you began, first of all, through Humphrey's biography, to see these glimpses into the bigger story, because he quotes some various things and tells you, of course, about the way in which Tolkien was developing his whole legendarium. So you get that, and then you get the Silmarillion. You've got an entire book of pieces that Tolkien himself wrote, obviously seen through the editorship of Christopher, which really enriched this world. And you thought, oh, it's so much more than as the Lord of the Rings is so much more than The Hobbit. This is so much bigger and more magical and mysterious and an extraordinary world than I'd actually thought and realized. I think a lot of it I didn't understand. I didn't necessarily relate it all to what I'd read in The Lord of the Rings. But yes, they were powerful new openings into understanding about Tolkien. Unfinished Tales, when that came out in 1980, and at the time I was writing the scripts for the radio series in 1980 for 1981, and I came across The Hunt for Gollum, and where there's an account of how Gollum was arrested on the borders of Mordor, taken to Barad-dûr and tortured, and that's where he revealed enough, the name of Baggins and the Shire, to send the Black Riders on their quest. And I decided this was a perfect moment to open the radio series. So there was a kind of an early kind of a sort of chronological introduction about what Middle-earth was and the forging of the rings. But then it immediately went into Gollum on the rack in Mordor, being tortured by the mouth of Sauron and revealing the name Baggins and the Shire. And, of course, many people who hadn't yet read Unfinished Tales, it'd been out for 6 or 8 months, but anyway, those who hadn't immediately sort of wrote to the BBC in high dudgeon and said, the series has hardly started and this man is making up nonsense about it. It isn't from the book at all. And it gave me great glee. I had, of course, cleared it with Christopher, but it gave me great glee to be able to write back and say, well, actually, go to Unfinished Tales pages, so-and-so to so-and-so. But that was my first instance of being able to take something from these other works and incorporate them into. It's the only thing that is in the Radio Lord of the Rings, but it is there, and it is a marker that at that point we then had Unfinished Tales, and we were already beginning to learn more. And then, of course, through Christopher's editorship, volume after volume of the history of Middle-earth came out, and each one brought new understandings, new revelations, new surprises, new perplexities, new conundrums.
Absolutely,
that's how it developed. And those books for me have always been. And this is not to diminish his scholarship at all, but they've always been to me a kind of secondary, even tertiary level of passion for me. But what doing this book about the Fall of Númenor has done for me, which is great to sometimes get a gift back when you're doing a piece of work, is being able to pull together some of those things and to try and understand just how vast Tolkien's creativity was. And for me, a slight sadness, I don't know whether it's worth talking about at some point, but a slight sadness that so much was yet to have been told. So much was there. When I look at the list of kings and rulers of Númenor, for example, and the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or however many there are, about whom nothing is given other than their date of birth, their date of ascension to the throne, their date of death. And that's just about it. And sometimes the names of their children, sometimes children, but no names. So, that does two things for me. First of all, it puts this book being The Lord of the Rings, in the context of all great myths and legends. It's like these are, and so what I think Christopher gave us in the history of Middle-earth are these fragments, like people piecing together some early document that might be, early Middle English or Aramaic or whatever. They're like the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're fragments and pieces, some more developed than others. But from it, you get this sense, if not of more understanding about specific things, and there's still a lot of conundrums, what you get is this huge sense of one person's total kind of creativity. But with it, for me, comes a kind of sadness that Tolkien was so often distracted into sort of cul-de-sacs and U-turns and byways that he didn't give us more. The story of Aldarion and Erendis, for example, it's such a rich story, and then suddenly it stops and Christopher pieces together how it ends. But, why, if only we'd had his complete ending to the story told by him, not in the fragments that we have linked together by Christopher. So it's like it's amazing. It's an amazing discovery when you get into the world of Tolkien, but it also comes with lots of hooks on which you want to hang questions and observations and notes and frustrations. But I don't know where we started with that answer, but that's where I've ended up.
No, that's fine. But this seems like a really perfect time to segue, as we've been talking about Númenor. Let's talk about the book, because I know there's a lot. Yes, there it is. There's a lot of people who are really excited by this book. So can you talk to us a little bit about, well, first of all, why? Why did you do this project? And then a little bit about your process would be absolutely wonderful to hear.
Well, I think for some time, HarperCollins had been, the publishers of Tolkien, had been realizing that there was a particular hole in the market, if you like, but more importantly, a hole in the way in which Tolkien's work was presented to readers, in that although, say, the great tales had been extracted from other sources and brought into a new book form, there was no way of actually looking to understand the history of Númenor, its rise, its fall, other than through, I think on my count, not heavily, sometimes just a note in one book and note in another, but 13 to 14 volumes that Christopher Tolkien saw through the press. Obviously, majorly the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, but dotted through the history of Middle-earth, there are pieces about Númenor and of course, also in The Lord of the Rings. So when HarperCollins approached me and said that this was a project they wanted to undertake because they thought that it would be good to have a single book which brought together as much as you could of the Númenorian stuff into one volume. So to be clear to anybody, this has not got new material by Professor Tolkien. It hasn't got additions of the kind that we saw in the other books that Christopher edited. And there's several reasons for that, I think. I mean, there may well be more material. I'm sure there is. But the point of this was it was the first book after Carl Hostetter's Nature of Middle-earth. It was the first book to be edited by someone when Christopher was not alive. And that obviously had a bearing for the family, that they had to trust and understand who was going to do that work and what was going to be in it. So asked how to approach it if I was given the job, I thought the only logic, and this is going back to the logic I think I pursued at the time of the radio version, was to say, I'm going to follow the chronology that Tolkien himself gave us in The Tale of Years. And that's what I did. So I went to that. And of course, that itself is full of anxieties and confusions as well, because sometimes he tells you something as being a kind of milestone or a marker in the history of Númenor, but without actually giving you any material to back it up. And some of the kings that he lists are not the same as the kings that you find listed in the line of Elros. in Unfinished Tales. So there's all these kind of complexities, but that was going to be my starting point. That was I'm going to take what he gave us as being the benchmarks of the 3,000 over 3,000 years of Númenor's existence, and I was going to into that intersperse the pieces of information that we had regarding those episodes where they existed. And that was kind of like a cut. Well, it was very much a cut. I won't say a cut and paste, because that is a bit demeaning to the process, because really what it consisted of was going through all those volumes, finding all the references, and then having to make the really painful decision of, do I put this in, or is this such a variant from what we have in what I consider to be the kind of master documents, say the Akilabeth in Lord of the Silmarillion, or is it something which can go into a footnote or a backnote, endnote, that can tell people where to go to find out more about this? And I decided it wasn't going to be a narrative in the way that Christopher amalgamated pieces of his father's work to tell a straight through narrative. It had to be a date orientated approach, which is what it is. But what I wanted to do was to tell the story as unencumbered as I could, but making sure that the endnotes provided people with the sources that they could go to if they wanted to explore more. You know, I mean, for example, the tragedy at the Gladden Fields, for example, which is strictly speaking a third age narrative because Sauron has already fallen, and so it's not actually in the second age, would have made a possibly quite a dramatic ending to the volume, because it's unlike the short version of what happened to the ring, which you get elsewhere. This was a very full version with narrative and dialogue, and would have sat well at the end of the book. But I was also conscious that it was a very long passage, and also that it was, strictly speaking, third age. So that isn't there, but there is a footnote that will take you to say, this is where you can read a much fuller account of sorry, my brain's now gone.
Elendil?
It's still there. But there is a note there to make sure that people can go there and find, a much fuller account of Isildur's demise and what happens. So it was, all the time I was thinking, can I include this? Can't I include that? People will complain that that's not there. People will criticize that I've added that. But to leaven it all the way through, because I was aware that quite a lot of this material I was using was either sketchy, if that's not an insulting word to use it, but fragmentary or first draft. I wanted to leaven it by bringing in as many as I could of extracts from the Lord of the Rings itself that would illustrate that. So, passages from the Council of Elrond, for example, will come at various moments where Elrond himself is recalling, for example, being there on the slopes of Mount Doom when Sauron is killed and the ring is taken. So interwoven, I hope, through it are enough things to make people go, oh, I remember that story, I know that story, and see how the second age relates to the third age. So that was the basic premise. Lots of notes, lots of books with stickers and scribbling all over them, and some of the passages early on, for instance, I set the scene with Tolkien's descriptions of Númenor as it was as an island, and that comes from both his brief description of Númenor and also from additional material that Carl Hofstad had put into his book, The Nature of Middle-earth. And there I decided there weren't going to be note numbers to tell you these 4 lines come from this source, these 4 lines come from that source. So those chapters are very much an amalgam, and it's declared, and it tells you where you can go and find the whole volume if you want. But so I tried to make that a understanding of the island, area by area, the beliefs and disciplines of the people, their pastimes and sports, the wildlife, the animals, the foliage, all of those things are dealt with just as a kind of piece about Númenor. And I think it gives, and the cities, and I think it gives quite a good picture of the island with which readers can start. Of course, it has to be said that in the process of deciding to do this, there was obviously an awareness on everybody's part that there was going to be a series on Amazon coming, which was called The Rings of Power. So, that wasn't, and of course, The Rings of Power is a hugely important part in the story of the Fall of Númenor, even though, of course, it's happening in Middle-earth, not on Númenor itself. But it leads to so many things that then subsequently affect Númenor, particularly, of course, Sauron's insidious way in which he worms his way into the confidences of the then king of Númenor. So that's how the book came together. My thrill about it really was, well, several things. First of all, in putting it together, of course, we had to have the approval of Bailey Tolkien, who's Christopher Tolkien's widow. And we also had to have the family and the estate online as well and on site. And they were very actively involved in following what we were doing and commenting, and Simon Tolkien particularly. So, it's come with quite a lot of work, quite a lot of thought gone into it. And I'm now obsessed with how many things aren't in it, which is like, I think the fate who writes a book, I just keep thinking, I could have put a note in about that, or I could have added that. But anyway, not in terms of Tolkien's text. I don't think there's anything there that or is out there that I regret not being in the book, but certainly in some of the interpretive notes on it could have been, would now be a little different. But the big thrill for me, beyond all of that, which was quite pleasing and thrilling, was the opportunity to work with Alan Lee, who I've known for 50 years, I guess. And although we've met and spent time together, particularly when I was working on the books about the Jackson films, because I spent quite a lot of time in New Zealand, and when I was in New Zealand, I spent time with both Alan and John Howe. So it was somebody who I'd known and been close to, but had never had a chance to work with on anything. And so the really, for me, the exciting opportunity was to sit on a Zoom call with Alan in Devon, and for us to have a conversation which went like, well, what scenes would you most like to paint from the second age that you've never had the opportunity to draw or paint? And him saying to me, well, what do you think are things that are in the text that you don't think have been properly or ever necessarily addressed in a visual sense? So, he would say, well, I've never had an opportunity to depict Khazad-dûm in all its glory as it was at the time of it, the height of the dwarves' empire there, and seized on a very small line, section in one of Tolkien's narratives, which tells how Galadriel passed through Khazad-dûm into the east, and that then became and is a painting in the book. And my saying, well, I've never seen anybody draw the people who are being led to their death at the Temple of on Númenor under Sauron's reign, as it were, or behind the throne reign. And that's a painting in the book. So it's got a sense of for Alan, I think, a chance to do things that he hadn't done before. And I think what I really love about his work, and I'm obviously not able to illustrate it, although some of the illustrations are now out there online, but is that when he draws some of the structures, as a drawing both of the sacrificing of victims at the temple on Númenor, but there's another one of the building of Barad-dûr, and it only shows a fraction of the building, but because of the scale of the picture, even though you're only seeing a little part of the building in relation to the landscape around it, you realise just how vast this building was. I mean, Alan's use of architecture and in relation to landscape is just fantastic. And then the sugar on the cake, or the cherry on the sugar on the cake, was that when we constructed the book, because it does follow the Tale of Years, so it's got this chronological arrangement. Now, sometimes one of Tolkien's headings from the Tale of Years may be followed by pages and pages of text from other places. Sometimes it may only be a short passage because that's all he wrote about it. And this left a few kind of lacunas through the book. There were gaps everywhere. And Alan, who was going to do a few headers and tailors for the passages, just decided he was going to fill as many of those as he could. So there are, I think, approaching 60, if not more than 60, pencil drawings, which he was doing right up to the last minute. And as a result, almost every, well, not almost every page, but many, many pages, there are one or even two of his illustrations on the spreads. So apart from anything to do with whether the book's any use to readers, from my point of view, is I keep saying to people, well, buy it just for Alan's pictures, because you've got 10 colour images there, plus the cover, which is also the front end paper of the actual Fall of Númenor. I can show you. It is out there online somewhere, but I don't know whether it will show up properly. But you know, this is the Fall of Númenor.
Oh goodness!
Now, of course, when it's on the cover, it's got writing on here, and there's writing over the back. But that's a hugely impressive piece of art, and it's the front end paper to the book. So it's worth having, folks. Buy it just for Alan's pictures, is what I say. But I hope it's got a few other uses as well.
Now, setting your modesty aside there, Brian, I mean, yes, obviously, Alan Lee's artwork is going to be a draw for people buying it. But the idea of having in one place all of these things about Númenor that before we'd had to go through the Acalabeth, the unfinished tales, the bits and pieces that are all over the history of Middle-earth, you are giving us this in one text. And, you know, as both a scholar and a fan of Tolkien, I just want to say thank you, because that's amazing to have.
Well, the big dilemma, which people who know about the history of Middle-earth will understand, the big dilemma was what to do about the Lost Road and the Notion Club papers, because they take a completely different approach to Tolkien's early concept of what Númenor was and what it stood for. And that became quite problematic, because the time travel story, which would have been the Lost Road, if it had ever been finished, was such that it required not only an understanding of the Númenorian aspects to it, but also the context within which Tolkien was writing this fictional story involving time travel from people from our world to an earlier age. And in the end, I decided that had the Númenorian chapters, as Christopher called them, had to be included, and they're included as an appendix because the setting is different and the names are different. I didn't feel comfortable in just running it into the story of the fall of Númenor, because it is the events that lead up to both the fall of Númenor and the escape of the exiles, and it could have sat there, but it would have been slightly uncomfortable in that it would have to be prefaced by a long explanation about the names being changed and who represented what. So that they are there as an appendix, and I felt that was very important. And there are references to the Notion Club papers and to all of the kind of ramifications of what that period of Tolkien's writing did to the development of Númenor. But as such, those texts already exist. And I did think, well, that's true of everything that's in the book, actually. It's all there somewhere. And what I wanted to try and keep was the essential story of Númenor, its rise, its fall, the rings of power, the last alliance. I wanted to keep all those things there as in one kind of place, but always, as I say, I will keep saying it, but it is important to me, but always with labels which tell you where can you go to look it up yourself, because to my mind, that is really important. If you're going to bring together disparate pieces from various places, not everybody will want to check them out or look them up or follow the route to find them. And I understand that. And not everybody wants to have, another, or have 12 or 13 volume, 14, 15, if you count the other books on your shelf in order to be able to understand the story of Númenor. But I wanted to give people, if nothing else, a guide to where you could then go to piece together more of the story yourself. If you wanted to know more about this, well, go in that direction, because there's stuff there that you can find, but it's all there. So it's kind of, I hope it's more than just a kind of Dorland Kindersley
oh goodness,
guide to Middle Earth, but essentially it's the bones of the story in as much detail as Tolkien gives us, with enough annotations to tell you where to go for more if you want it, and brilliant illustrations. I mean, the fact that Alan was not only able to make paintings of scenes and sequences which he had never touched or illustrated before is fantastic, but his pencil drawings, I think, also bring the book alive, because you've got pictures of landscape, of waterfalls, of trees, and even some dancing bears are in there.
The dancing bears made it excellent.
And but also people. So quite a number of his pencil drawings feature some of the monarchs or some of the characters, like Navi the dwarf, who created the inscriptions that are on the door of the doors to Khazad-dûm, the doors that the Fellowship enter through to go into Khazad-dûm. So there's some, I hope, enlightening and embellishing things that people will really, really enjoy.
I have no doubt, and I know you keep saying, bite, because Alan stuff and Alan stuff and Alan stuff. But look, this is also this is your stuff too.
I'm only saying that, Sarah, because I know Tolkien. I know Tolkien fans of old, because we've known each other for many, many years. I know that there will be fans who say, "Yeah, but you can't not put that in. Why isn't that in there?" So I know that's going to follow, and that has to be just, well, okay, yes. As my editor Chris Smith was saying to me, your stock answer to those needs to be, well, this is the choice that I made, but there could have been other choices. And of course, that's true of what Christopher did as well. You have to make a decision. The little pleasures I've had are things like where in the history of Middle Earth, Christopher has subsequently discovered that something his father wrote had been misprinted when the Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales came out. It's an odd word here and there, nothing more than that. But of course, the text can't be altered of those books now. So their correction appears in one of the volumes of Middle Earth, History of Middle Earth. And they're now embodied into the text. So if there was there's a couple of places in the Akellabeth where obviously the person setting the top followed the text that they were given incorrectly when setting the type, or Christopher misread a word, or whatever the source of it, and those words are now credited with a note to point out that this isn't a misprint, because just in case anybody went, well, it doesn't say that in the Silmarillion. So, and I rather like those little things that are like little Easter eggs that people can find if they want.
Yeah, a very different challenge for you than your previous adaptation work.
Yeah, well, in some senses, very much so. I mean, I've always done a lot of research for what I've done. For example, my biography on C.S. Lewis, which was written at a time when there was only one biography already in existence, which was the original Roger Lansing Green Walter Hooper book. Now, of course, there's legions of books about C.S. Lewis. But there I did a huge amount of research and reading, and so too with the book I did about the Reverend W. Awdry, who wrote the Thomas the Tank Engine books. So I'm not a stranger to research, and indeed as a broadcaster, although that research doesn't ever display itself other than in the end product. There are no footnotes to say where I got this or that from. I've always been very diligent in researching stuff, and I've always loved finding sources and bringing them together. So that's all. But essentially, my approach was, and I don't know, I've never asked HarperCollins, but I sense that they asked me because they know that my chief concern is to tell a story and to tell it in the best way I can. I would have loved to have had, if I'm honest, I'd love to have had the freedom that Christopher had to link bits of narrative, which could have been effortlessly linked, I think, in the style of. But if that's not too presumptive a thing to say. One of the things I've always done when I've approached dramatization, for example, is to, and because I knew the writers already, is to have some sense of having absorbed the writer's style. So when I adapted Mervyn Peake's books for radio, for example, and I didn't know Mervyn Peake, though I knew his widow and I knew many friends of his and his family, I had read so much of Peake that I was able, if need be, to write something that would sound as though it was in the Peake style, to be able to link two things together. Same with T.H. White when I did The Lord of the Rings. So it's a knack that I've always had, and I would love to have been able to have done that here. But it's too early. It's too early since the death of Christopher Tolkien for people to be able to do official books, I'm talking about, obviously, to do books that take that kind of liberty with, or perceived to be liberty with, Tolkien's text. And Carl, in his book, for example, really just presented the material as it was. The difference between what Carl did and what I've done, and that just shows a slight shift in the way the publishers approach Tolkien's work now, I think, is that I had the liberty the freedom to be able to arrange that material in a way which I had chosen, or we, the publishers, and I had chosen. Whereas Carl's material was kind of gathered together, but it was sometimes there was no natural necessarily linking between any of the material, sometimes just a page and a half of an interesting piece of text. I had the benefit, of course, that I was dealing with something which already had the structure of a story. It may be dissipated amongst many sources, but the story was there. Of course, there are gaps in it because Tolkien didn't finish everything that he set out to write. But as what is there is the essence of what he had written about Númenor in its pretty final stage, which is why earlier versions are alluded to or referred to. But what we have, as much as we can, is how he saw the Second Age, at the point when he really stopped creating anything further. And that, I think, is supported by the extracts from The Lord of the Rings itself. So, for example, at the Council of Elrond, Glóin talks about Khazad-dûm at the height of its beauty and magnificence, and so that extract of that it's a ballad really, or a poem which he recites. That appears where he's talking about in the history of Númenor. But tagged as what it is, not presented as a Second Age manuscript, but as a Third Age remembrance of the Second Age. Those kind of things, or for example, Legolas talking about Lothlorien, or Aragorn finding the final sprig of the white tree on Mount Mendelluin. Comes in the conversation about the white tree. So those kind of things, I hope, give it enough of a link to what we know about The Lord of the Rings, even for some people who will, of course, know The Lord of the Rings only through the Jackson movies, but they will know about the white tree and they will know about Khazad-dûm and Lothlorien. So, but whether the Second Age, whether the Amazon Second Age series does anything for people wanting to find in this, because of course the Second Age, as presented on Amazon, is really the last 3,000 something years of the island, and that's it. I found it quite a jolt. I mean, you and I talked on a panel on the day after, or the day of, I can't remember, it was the evening of, wasn't it, of the first.
It was the day of, yeah.
The first two episodes appeared. And I think the thing that I didn't understand clearly then, which of course you do once the series has played out to the end of the first season, is that of course we are not seeing the references to it, people talking about it, but we're only seeing Númenor at the point when it's approaching its final decline and fall, and that's intriguing. So anybody who wants to know about the Second Age is going to be quite surprised if they turn to this volume, because there's another 2,000 something or other years that they didn't know about. So I find that quite amusing in a way.
Well, let's touch briefly on the Rings of Power then. As an adaptation, I mean, you are one of the foremost experts in Tolkien adaptation. So can you share some of your thoughts on what you're seeing from the Rings of Power and how they've approached their adaptation?
I'm being careful what I say about it for several reasons, like death threats, no, seriously, and because we only have the first season so far, and this is obviously much.
We have to remember that. Yeah, it's going to be a long 5-season arc.
The things that I really want to say about it that are, I feel, really good are the fact that what they have done is to capture and embody and use what is already now our visual understanding of Middle Earth, through the Jackson films. And they, of course, have just gone off and done their own thing. I think wisely they've linked it to the look, and obviously it's partly because John Howe working on both of the projects. They've linked it very much to what we visually expected to see, and that richness is undoubtedly there. The amount of money that's been spent on the series is, as they say, the money's on the screen because it looks fantastic. So I don't think there's any question about that at all. And anybody who has followed The Lord of the Rings will come to this with a complete acceptance of the world that's been presented to them. I think they've faced a huge amount of challenges, as one would expect. And as looking at this as a dramatist now, how would I have tackled it? Well, I would have done probably exactly what they've done, in the sense that once you realise that this age spans 3,441 years or whatever it is, that you cannot, in terms of a serial which people are going to tune into and watch, for week on week, and of course now year on year, you cannot hope to do that if you're constantly changing characters every couple of hundred years. Because although Númenorians have a long life, their life, has a termination point, and indeed, death and the Númenorians is a complete theme to the whole of the Númenorian story, and into the fall of Númenor at the end, unquestionably. So all that is absolutely vital. But how do you do that in terms of hooking an audience and holding an audience and making them care about the characters? If perhaps every 2 seasons you're going to have a new set of characters carrying on the story. That's not a good way of structuring any kind of drama that you want people to follow, like Game of Thrones, for example, or any of the other epic series that have been on television. So I see immediately their problem, and I see immediately why they've had to lock into that particular period, because it's the period which is closest to where they're going to end, and it's the period which includes the forging of the rings, although that's been slightly sort of shifted and relocated. And I think we all have to realise that when you're dramatising something, you have to change things. I was interested recently, and Nick Groom has written a great book called 21st Century Tolkien, which I really recommend to anybody, which is about really the cultural representation of Tolkien's legendarium. And he points out, which I valued because I was kind of unaware that I had done it, because it was many years ago, of the radio version, that what I had done was give what appeared to be an apparent chronology that absolutely worked, but had used enough sleight of hand to not dislocate the reader who knew where some of these episodes happened, but to keep them in a way that worked together. And I obviously did do that, but I'd kind of forgotten that I had. So, I have sympathy for the fact that these writers are having to align enough material into each of the seasons to make sense of and keep continuity with the overall theme. And that sometimes has required them to time shift and move things around. I think if there's something that I wish was there, rather than saying it's a criticism, I wish there had been more about Númenor, why it existed. There are flashbacks. There's a flashback to what is clearly the first age in the very first episode of the Rings of Power, and I think you could have lived with some flashbacks to the fall of Melkor, for instance, Morgoth. I think you could have seen more of what Sauron's role was at that time to give it an impact now. I think we could have seen a little bit more of the beauty and majesty of Númenor in its early incarnation. I think the creation of it would have been magical to have seen on screen, but possibly too difficult. I think, for instance, it would have been great if we could have understood the relationship between Elrond and Elros. I find it a bit perplexing that clearly the statue, which is such a dominant feature of the harbour on Númenor in the series, is, one has to assume, the first king, Elros. And yet we have Elrond saying, I was an orphan, without any acknowledgement that he had a brother and that his brother was the first king of Númenor. And I think there could have been ways in which some of that material could have been integrated. But I also know that the process of making any dramatization, it's true of what I did. I mean, I remember, this is a slight sort of side trip, but I remember that we had come to the penultimate episode of the radio version, recording it in the studio, and everything was overrunning because the farewells sequence, which of course is such a huge end of the Return of the King, is so long and so many aspects to it. And I'd included as many as I could because I wanted to have Treebeard and Elrond and Galadriel, those characters, in the final episode. It was important to me that they all played back into the story. That we came to a point where the producer said to me, we can't accommodate all this material in the final episode. You'll have to drop all this stuff about the Battle of Bywater. And for me, that was kind of like, it filled me with horror, because for me, and I was talking about this at Oxenmoot, for me that the final jewel in Tolkien's creation is the fact that when you get back to Hobbiton, that even the lovely Shire, wonderful Hobbiton, has been corrupted by the evil that had emanated from Mordor through Saruman. And for me, it was unthinkable that there couldn't be something there that said, the battle isn't won until it's finally won, until it's won on your own step. And so I went away that night and rewrote that episode, cramming everything into what was really a fight in a Bag End rather than at Bywater, but keeping Saruman, keeping Sharky and Grima, and having that final understanding that this is what we were fighting for. We weren't fighting for some great vast continent and elves and dwarves and so on. We were fighting for our own little patch of our world, our patch of Middle Earth. And that's where you have to stand and fight at the end. So I rewrote it overnight, and that's how we recorded it. And similarly, I know that Peter Jackson, well, of course, we know many of the things that he filmed because we've now seen the extended versions, and we've seen the outtakes and so on. So we know how much more he filmed. And that it's one of the problems and the issues. So I'm sure that some of these things I'm saying about Rings of Power were things that were in their consciousness and their thinking, and that as they approach the task. I don't doubt that for a moment, but I miss some of those aspects being there. And of course, we're left with one or two kind of puzzles like, the Númenorians have now discovered that the forging of the first three rings was influenced by Sauron, but we don't know yet what's going to be or how they're going to create the rest of those rings, because there's more than three rings. There's some interesting things, which I'm sure they will sort in their terms of their storytelling. So I think for fans who know a lot about it, it's quite difficult because you have to balance in your mind what I'm being given here is a distillation of something. But I think the most important thing to remember, and I always say this about any dramatization at all, is that it doesn't replace the original. And that is, that's so important that we remember that the books are still there. Yeah. And it doesn't matter.
Yeah, we'll always have those.
It's always there. And also, and this is maybe will shock some people in my saying it, but sometimes if all you know ever about Tolkien is what you find in Peter Jackson's films or The Rings of Power, if that's all you ever know, but you take from it something of grandeur and magnificence and drama and a remarkableness. If you take that away with you, well, you've taken something from it that you wouldn't have had before. So, and that combined with the fact that the originals are always there, and people do go back to the originals. You know, I mean, there's no question. I mean, I remember traveling on tube trains in London after Jackson's films and seeing masses of people reading the paperback because they wanted to read it. And the same with Harry Potter. The moment the Harry Potter films came out, and then when the publishers realized that there were adults who wanted to read Harry Potter, they actually designed adult-themed covers for the series so that they wouldn't feel embarrassed at sitting there with what looked like a wizard on the cover. They could have some kind of dark, sinister image that would look appealing and the kind of book that an adult would read. So, you know, there's always a way of finding the original, as there always was. And, in fact, more access is possible now because we have so many other ways of accessing things through through the internet, through audio versions and so on. You know, there's all the books out there. If you don't want to read them yourself, you can have them read by anybody. And I understand Andy Serkis is now limbering up to narrate the whole of the Silmarillion. And of course, he's done a brilliant job at The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So, you know, and there's Rob Inglis is reading out there. So there's ways of receiving Tolkien's story are still there. And what I love about the visual and the audio, the oral as well, I guess, is that this story, as told by Tolkien, not only was parts of it told orally to his friends, the Inklings, but of course it is in a long tradition of oral storytelling, which Tolkien was well aware of and familiar with. And so I don't have a problem with the story being told other than on a printed page, because all of the great stories of the world initially, you know, the great fairy stories and the Greek myths, they were all told. They were passed on by word of mouth. You know, there were bards who went around and told stories. That was their job to do because many people didn't read. And even up into the Dickens time, when Dickens was publishing his stories in sort of serialized form, week on week or month on month, that local people would club together to buy a copy of the next extract or episode, and the person who was the best reader or the best educated person in the group they would all go together into one person's house and they would read aloud Dickens' story. So this oral tradition, you know, which is behind Tales of the Brother Grimm and Perrault and all the other fairy tale collectors of stories, all the myths and the legends, they all owed that to the passing on of the story. So everything passes on the story, and in every telling, as in our own lives, if we tell a story, every telling is never quite the same. What I've said to you today is not the same as I will necessarily say tomorrow or have said several days ago or a month ago or a year ago, because sometimes you forget things, sometimes you add things, you improvise, you make something more dramatic than it might have been in one person's telling. So that's how these things have been passed on to us. So the fact that the stories, Tolkien's stories, of course, yes, they're books and they should be respected as books, but they also have a quality about them which enables them to be and begs for them to be passed on through other media. And, you know, Tolkien himself knew that. And when he talked about I can't say with hand on heart that I think that he would have ever looked upon The Rings of Power or Jackson's films or even my radio version as being what he had in mind when he talked about other people bringing their talents to
other minds and hands.
Other minds and hands in dance, music, theatre, drama. You know, I'm not sure he would have quailed, actually. I think maybe I shouldn't have said that when he saw some of the things that have been done. But, you know, that is a fact that we are keeping alive the whole concept of what Tolkien created through all of these things. They're not diminishing it, really. They are just there, and they either embellish it and give us something new from it, but rarely do they take anything from it because the original is unassailable. It's still there. I mean, I think my approach, and it's why I think the radio version has survived in the way that it has, my approach was absolutely that I wanted to put everything as literally as I could onto radio, and that was my driving ambition. There's very little in there that is created or made up. to put it crudely. There are quite a lot of things that aren't there, and they're not there for, usually for dramatic reasons. Obviously, Tom Bombadil, the whole episode, which people often complain about, that I didn't put it in. And I didn't put it in for the simple reason that I knew it was a digression dramatically from a storytelling point of view, that the Black Riders were the source of anxiety and tension in the telling of the story for me. And that's what I had to stick with. But that doesn't mean, and I did later dramatise the Tom Bombadil episodes, but to me it was always, can this earn its place? If it can't earn its place for some reason, usually because the material wasn't there, I didn't know enough about the Prince of Tolemroth, for example, to include the character, because he only has a handful of words in the narrative, and it either meant making stuff up, or it meant having to spend long kind of discursive dialogue where people told us who he was and why he was, and so on. But by and large, my route was always to tell it as it is. But I also respect the fact that when you move into another medium, you can't always tell it as it is. And I created dialogue because there are scenes where the Fellowship, there's 9 characters in a scene, and Tolkien doesn't give you dialogue for all of those 9 characters. It may be Aragorn and Gandalf and Frodo who are talking, but there's nothing necessarily from Sam or Merry or Pippin or Gimli or Legolas. Mm-hmm. And there are times there where, particularly on radio and film, they can be standing there and they don't have to say anything, but they're present. But on radio, if they're not speaking or having some involvement, then they might as well be dead, because you can't hear them, you can't see them, because we see what we hear. So, I did make up stuff there, and hopefully always taking something in Tolkien's text to put it into a question from Merry or Pippin. I remember Michael Bakewell, my colleague who dramatised the other 13 episodes to mine. I remember Mike was saying that he had a letter from someone who said, why have you made Pippin so stupid in this radio? And it was simply because Pippin was a useful character to be able to say why or how or what if. But since he was always a fool of a toque as far as Gandalf was concerned, I felt
it was handy.
It's okay. It was handy, yeah.
This is giving us a really fascinating insight into the thinking behind adaptation. And I know our listeners and watchers are going to be really interested in it. But I'm going to bring this discussion sort of towards its end by asking you what is, on the surface, a really simple question, but it's never really a simple question. What's your favourite moment or part in all of Tolkien's work? Is there a moment that you return to, or one that stays in your mind the most? Or, I mean, for some people, of course, that changes over the years. But is there one right now for you that's my moment?
As you say, that is so hard. It's like saying which of your children you like most or best. I don't have any children, so I don't have to worry about that one. But, well, it does change, so I don't think it's always the same. I think one, and maybe it's surprising in a way, but I think the piece that perhaps most draws me back again and again to it is the whole of the few chapters leading up to the destruction of the ring. I think it's the sadness, the struggle, Frodo's struggle, the great love and compassion which Sam demonstrates, the tortured dilemma which for Gollum reaches its kind of zenith when he is there and he wants to have the ring, he wants to be free of the ring, but none of those things are possible. And really, I suppose the dramatic moment for me is really so important. It's like that end of it's like the scouring of the Shire. It's that moment where even Frodo, who's borne this burden, is finally challenged. And now I have come here. I do not choose to do the thing that I've come to do. That moment is, for me, absolutely crucial to our understanding of of the corruption which Tolkien is describing in the Ring and the embodying of Sauron and evil. That even then, the character who has been so faithful and through great travail has come to this point is actually challenged by it. And of course, the kind of deeply satisfying idea that it is Gollum who has been the antipathy of anybody who should be listened to or followed or certainly rescued and saved, is a character who actually finally completes the quest in the way that he does. That's a hugely dramatic passage, and to me, when it ends with them lying in the ash and the line, the eagles are coming, which is of course a reflection of a scene in The Hobbit as well, much far less dramatic actually than that, but it is a callback, if you like. And yes, of course, it gives everybody the opportunity to say, well, why the heck didn't the Eagles take the ring in the first place and drop it straight into Mount Doom instead of all that?
Because they are not a taxi service.
Indeed, exactly so. But so that would be one of mine. But there are many. There are so many. I love the Lothlorien episodes. I love for its weird and frighteningness the passage through the dead marshes, for example. I love the idea of the Shire. I find some of it quite, we'd say now, twee or whatever. I think playing that, I found that when we did the radio version, playing it out, you have to be quite careful because it can so easily seem just a bit, kind of, I don't know, twee is the only word I can kind of think of, really. The integrity of the characters, their humanity, and obviously, I suppose the other most moving moment is where Sam believes Frodo is dead, and it's his duty to take the ring on. That is another moment, which is where, it's about having to take a decision which you never expected to have to do. It's about being stronger than you think you're able to ever be, and it's about leaving someone that you care and love to do what you see as being your duty. With no hope of it ever being right. And I think that hopelessness is a theme which I find so deeply moving through the whole book. That actually, from the moment when Frodo says, I will take the ring at the Council of Elrond, I will take the ring, but I do not know the way. From that moment on, you are burdened with this thought that, what is the way? Is that way, can it be accomplished? And then in sequence after sequence, we see all the threats that are there to prevent that from happening, whether it's, it's Boromir's betrayal, whether it's the Watcher in the water at the gates when they're trying to get into Khazad-dûm, whether it's the orc attack in Khazad-dûm. At every single stage, there is more and more peril. And then, at the breaking of the Fellowship, it kind of then becomes something which is completely other and is not, and doesn't follow the usual quest narratives either, because you actually have three separate narratives going on, three quests going on together. Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas seeking Merry and Pippin, for example, and Frodo and Sam, and then with Gollum setting out to achieve Frodo's quest, and then all the other involvements that come from Rohan and Gandalf and so on. So, those meshing all those quests together, and all the time knowing that the peril is on such a small person, and yet Tolkien's or Gandalf's belief that sometimes it's the small hands that turn the wheels of fate. It's not the great powers, it's the small people, which I think he sincerely believed and felt, and was a residue from his experiences in the First World War, that it's small people who carry the burden, not the great powers. It's the small people. And I actually feel very affectionate towards all those partings. I mean, Peter Jackson dispensed with them really, but in terms of reading the book, I love the fact that we get to go back and meet those characters again, and that Legolas and Gimli will go off and explore. Legolas explore the glittering caves, which is so alien from his own kind of habitat and so on, just as Gimli was allowed to be a part of Lothlorien and have the blessing of the lady. So so much to treasure in the book, and there's not much of it that I don't think, I just want to read that again. Now you've made me want to read the last passage again. So.
And that, of course, is what brings us all returning to Tolkien time and time again, that there's always something that speaks to us at different times. Not necessarily, oh, this is something new, it'll be something familiar, but it is saying something new at different times in our lives and when we're going through different things, experiencing different things.
There's a lot of sadness at the heart of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Melancholy and sadness, and, you know, whether it, and often a sense of despair. You know, you see the despair in Theoden, you see the despair in Denethor. There is so much of humanity in the book, and those people who think, oh, it's just about, you know, warriors and elves and dwarves, and what they don't understand, if they haven't tried it and read it, is that the book is about, most of all, about human emotions, and it doesn't really matter whether those characters are men or elves or dwarves or hobbits. It's about the emotions that they experience. And that Tolkien, who I imagine, just from what I've read about him, was probably quite a close character, probably not given to extreme emotional demonstrations of his emotions. Mm-hmm. In this book, he shows us those emotions which we're all so familiar with, you know, emotions of loss, of bereavement, of love, you know, and some of them are cast in ways that today, you know, are open for questioning or whatever. But, you know, the love of Sam and for Frodo, you know, which is obviously has its parallels within the kind of officer common serviceman's experience in the First World War, and for some people in the Second World War, is actually it doesn't matter the context. It's about human love, and it doesn't have another agenda other than the agenda of love. And I think Tolkien understood a lot of that. I mean, the longer I live and the more I read about Tolkien and the more I read his work, the more I think, although there is little outward expression of his own spiritual faith, that his spiritual faith does underlie a huge amount of his writing, and people have written about it. And I think there's still stuff to be written about that, actually, because his own, always carefully expressed, because he would never have wanted to have tried to present. You know, he always said he hated allegory, despite the fact, of course, that Leaf by Niggle, one of his pieces of writing, is an allegory.
He used it regularly, yes. Typical Tolkien. Say one thing, do another.
Exactly. And if I was to pick anything from Tolkien's writing to say that's one of my favourite pieces of his writing, it would be Leaf by Niggle, as opposed to anything else, because it is such a perfect story and perfectly expressed, and at the same time is revealing. Is also autobiographical, if a fantasy story can be autobiographical, and I think it can. So that, I would say, is really important. But, you know, the essence of his spirituality is there embodied in this book, and whether you acknowledge it and see it as that, or whether you just see it as human emotion and love and respect for people and things, then that's great too. You know, I mean, his role as an advocate for conservation and looking after the world is something which should speak to everybody today, as they read the book. You know, the love of the countryside, the love of landscape, the hatred of landscape despoiled. Those are all things which Tolkien puts into this book. So, you know, there's a damn good story. Let's face it, there's a damn good story.
Oh, yeah.
And then all that extra that you've got as well, you know. And if there's a problem with the Silmarillion or the Second Age, I think it is the fact that there isn't at the heart of it, and it's true of the Hobbit too. You know, the Hobbit is essentially a quest of revenge, is what it is, about recovering something that you've lost, whereas the Lord of the Rings is about destroying something which you have, which is quite the opposite. And the passion that you feel about the people involved in the quest of the Fellowship is quite different to that you feel for burglar Baggins and Thorin's dwarves in The Hobbit. It's quite different, and the Rings of Power presents similar issues there, I think, in its structure, because it is about many, many things, and there are all those things we're talking about embodied in it, but across such a vast span of years that I think it's very hard to bring it into another form. But we'll see. They've got 4 more seasons of 8 episodes each to it's 4 or 5, 4 I think more of 8 episodes to convince me that I'm wrong, and I hope they will.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having a conversation after it, and we can decide just exactly whether they've done that.
Out, Sarah. I mean, I'm pushing on now, and the next episode the next season doesn't come out till 2024. So, goodness knows when episode 5 will arrive. I may not even be.
We're gonna go on the premise that you will be around, and we will have that conversation. Okay, well, Brian, thank you so much, because I know that the people who tune into the Tolkien Experience podcast will have absolutely loved hearing your thoughts on adaptation, on your work, on your interaction with Tolkien himself. It's been wonderful to hear your thoughts on that, and to really get an insight into you as well as somebody who is really significant in the Tolkien world. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for asking me, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @LukeB.Shelton.
I'm @SR.Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.